I never thought my own family would look at me like I was nothing more than a burden with empty pockets. But sometimes life has a way of teaching people that they shouldn't judge a book by its worn cover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Princess, and at 72 years old, I learned that respect isn't something you lose with age. It's something you fight to keep. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window as I stirred my coffee, watching the steam rise from the old ceramic mug that Robert had given me on our 20th wedding anniversary. 28 years had passed since I lost him to cancer, and I still reached for 2 mugs every morning before catching myself. Old habits, they say, die hard. My little house on Maple Street in Riverside had been our sanctuary for 45 years. Robert and I had bought it as newlyweds with dreams bigger than our bank account, and somehow we'd made it work. The white picket fence he'd painted every spring was now my responsibility, though my arthritis made the task more challenging than it used to be. The rose garden we'd planted together still bloomed every summer, a testament to the love we'd cultivated in this place. I suppose most people in Riverside saw me as they saw every other widow my age. A sweet old lady living on Social Security, clipping coupons and counting pennies. I'd catch them at the grocery store, giving me those sympathetic looks when I'd compare prices or wait for sales. They meant well, but they didn't know the whole story. Nobody did, really, except Robert, and he'd taken our secrets with him to the grave. My son Michael had been the light of our lives. Born after 7 years of trying and 3 heartbreaking miscarriages, he was our miracle baby. Robert used to joke that we spoiled him rotten, carrying him around like a little prince. Maybe we did. Michael grew up knowing he was loved, but somewhere along the way, that love got tangled up with expectation and entitlement. He'd been a good student, graduated from State University with a business degree, and landed a decent job at an accounting firm in the city. For years, he'd visit every Sunday, bringing flowers and staying for my pot roast. We'd sit on the front porch afterward, talking about his work, his dreams, his plans for the future. Those were golden years, when it felt like our family bond was unbreakable. Everything changed when he met Jessica at some company party 3 years ago. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Long blonde hair, perfect smile, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships, and she'd grown up in a world where problems were solved with credit cards and connections. The first time Michael brought her home for dinner, I knew she was measuring everything. The way her eyes swept over my modest living room, taking in the old furniture and family photos in discount store frames. How she politely declined my homemade apple pie, claiming she was watching her figure. The careful way she complimented my quaint little house in a tone that made it sound like a museum piece. But Michael was smitten, completely head over heels, and I wanted him to be happy. So I smiled and tried to make conversation about her job at her father's business, asked about her interests, and did my best to be welcoming. She was polite enough, in that surface-level way that keeps things pleasant without ever getting real. They married 18 months later in an elaborate ceremony that cost more than I'd spent on anything in my entire life. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for Robert's funeral and saved for special occasions. Jessica's family filled 3/4 of the church, cousins and business associates and country club friends, while our side looked sparse by comparison. Just me, a few old neighbors, and Robert's brother from out of state. During the reception at the country, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Club. I overheard Jessica's mother telling someone how charming it was that Michael came from such humble beginnings, like poverty was some kind of character-building exercise that made for good storytelling. I smiled and nodded when she introduced me as Michael's sweet mother to her friends. But inside, I felt like a curiosity, something to be politely acknowledged, and then forgotten. After the wedding, the Sunday dinners became less frequent. Michael would call instead, usually when Jessica was busy with her friends or shopping. He'd always ask how I was doing, if I needed anything, but there was a distance in his voice that hadn't been there before. When they did visit, Jessica would sit stiffly in my living room, checking her phone and making subtle comments about how I didn't need to go to so much trouble with cooking. The real shift came about 6 months after their wedding, when they bought their house. It was a sprawling colonial in Riverside's most exclusive neighborhood, complete with a 3-car garage and a pool. Jessica posted pictures of every room on social media, talking about their dream home and their plans for entertaining. The mortgage payment alone was probably more than I spent in 3 months. That's when the comments started. Little things at first, wrapped in what sounded like concern. Jessica would mention how I was getting up there and maybe shouldn't be struggling to maintain such an old house. She'd suggest that I might be more comfortable in a nice senior community where I wouldn't have to worry about yard work and repairs. Always with that bright smile and helpful tone, like she was doing me a favor by pointing out my limitations. Michael started echoing her concerns. He'd noticed things during his visits. A loose board on the porch steps, a dripping faucet, the way I moved a little slower than I used to. Instead of offering to help fix these things like he might have in the past, he'd shake his head and talk about how maintaining a house was a lot for someone your age, Mom. The money conversations began around their first anniversary. Jessica would make offhand comments about how, quote, expensive everything is these days, and how young couples really struggle to get established. She'd talk about their plans for renovating the kitchen or taking a vacation to Europe, then sigh about how they'd have to save up for years to afford such luxuries. I started to feel like my very existence was an inconvenience, a reminder of the modest circumstances Michael had come from. When I'd offer to contribute something for birthdays or holidays, maybe $50 for a nice dinner out or a small gift, Jessica would get that pinched look around her eyes and say something like, "Oh, princess, you don't need to worry about us. We know money's tight for you." The worst part was watching Michael change. My confident, loving son began to look embarrassed when Jessica would make these comments. Instead of defending me or shutting down her implications, he'd just nod along or change the subject. It was like he was ashamed of where he'd come from, ashamed of me. The breaking point came last autumn, on what should have been a happy occasion. Michael had gotten a promotion at work, and they'd invited me over for dinner to celebrate. I was so proud of him, my boy making his way up in the world, and I wanted to do something special to mark the moment. I'd been saving money for months, putting aside $20 or $30 here and there from my grocery budget and the small jobs I did for neighbors. Cleaning houses, watching pets when people went out of town, selling vegetables from my garden at the farmer's market. I'd managed to save $800, and I thought it would make a wonderful gift for their celebration. I presented the money in a card that evening, telling them how proud I was of Michael's success and how I wanted to contribute to their happiness. Maybe they could use it for their vacation fund, or put it toward the kitchen renovation Jessica was always talking about. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked uncomfortable, glancing between the money and his wife. Jessica's perfectly painted lips curved into what might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. "Oh, princess," she said in that syrupy voice that always made my skin crawl. "That's so sweet of you, but we really can't accept this." She pushed the card back across their polished dining table like it was contaminated. "We don't need money from a broke old lady. You should keep this for your own expenses. Doctor visits, prescriptions, things like that." The words hit me like a physical blow. Broke old lady, that's how she saw me, how she'd probably always seen me. Not as Michael's mother who'd sacrificed and saved to raise him, not as a woman who'd lived through 72 years of joy and sorrow and everything in between. Just a broke old lady whose contributions were unwelcome and embarrassing. Michael didn't say anything. He just sat there, fork halfway to his mouth, looking anywhere but at me. My own son, letting his wife dismiss me like I was nothing. I took the card back with hands that trembled slightly, folded it carefully, and put it back in my purse. "Of course," I said, proud that my voice stayed steady. "I understand." The rest of the dinner passed in polite small talk about Michael's new responsibilities at work and Jessica's latest shopping trip. I complimented her pot roast, though it was dry and oversalted, and listened to their plans for upgrading their sound system. When it was time to leave, Jessica hugged me with the same enthusiasm she might show for a distant acquaintance, and Michael walked me to my car with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Mom, he started as I unlocked my old Honda, but I cut him off with a wave. "It's fine, sweetheart," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. "I'm just happy for your success." Driving home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, burning anger. Not the quick flash of irritation that comes and goes, but the deep, steady flame that burns when someone has truly wronged you. Jessica's words echoed in my head. "We don't need money from a broke old lady." Well, I thought as I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment in the darkness, maybe it was time to show them exactly what this broke old lady was capable of. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Robert's old address book, running my finger down pages of names and numbers I hadn't called in years. Some of the entries were crossed out, friends and business associates who'd passed away or moved on, but others remained, waiting for the right moment to be useful again. I thought about the metal box hidden behind the water heater in my basement, the one I hadn't opened since Robert's funeral. Inside were documents and certificates and account numbers that told a very different story than the one Jessica had constructed about my financial situation. Robert had been a careful man, a planner who believed in preparing for every possibility. What he'd prepared for, what we'd built together in quiet secrecy, was about to become very relevant. The next morning, I put on my best dress, not the navy funeral dress, but the burgundy one I'd bought years ago and never found the right occasion to wear, and drove to the First National Bank of Riverside. I hadn't been inside the building in months, usually handling my simple transactions at the drive-thru, but today called for a face-to-face conversation. Margaret Williams, the branch manager, recognized me immediately. She'd started as a teller when Robert was still alive and had worked her way up through the years. We'd watched her get married, have children, and build her career, the way small-town people follow each other's lives through all the important milestones. "Mrs. Patterson," she said warmly, rising from her desk when I approached. "How lovely to see you. Please, sit down. What can I help you with today?" I settled into the comfortable chair across from her desk and folded my hands in my lap. "Margaret dear, I need to discuss some accounts that have been dormant for quite some time. I think it's time to wake them up." Her eyebrows rose slightly, and she turned to her computer screen, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. After a moment, her expression changed from polite interest to something much more attentive. "Oh," she said softly, scrolling through information I couldn't see. "Oh my. Mrs. Patterson, I had no idea you had these accounts with us. Some of these certificates of deposit have been automatically renewing for years." I smiled, feeling some of the weight I'd carried for months beginning to lift. Robert was very thorough in his planning. He wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of, but he also wanted me to be careful about who knew our business. Small towns talk, you know. Margaret nodded, still studying her screen. "These accounts, Mrs. Patterson, they've grown considerably over the years. The interest, the automatic renewals, the dividends from the investment portfolio we've been managing." She looked up at me with something like awe. "You're quite comfortable, aren't you?" "Comfortable enough," I said. "But I've been living as if I wasn't, and I think that's been a mistake." Robert always told me that money was a tool, and tools are meant to be used when the time is right. We spent the next hour going over my financial situation, which was far more robust than even I had realized. Robert's careful investments had grown steadily over the decades. His life insurance policy had matured into a substantial sum, and the small monthly amounts I'd been depositing from my part-time work had added up to more than I'd expected. The truth was, I could have been living very differently all these years. I could have renovated my house, bought a new car, traveled to places Robert and I had only dreamed about. Instead, I'd chosen to live modestly, partly from habit, and partly from the fear that if I spent too freely, I'd end up destitute in my old age. But sitting in Margaret's office, looking at numbers that represented security and possibilities, I realized that my fear had cost me more than money. It had cost me respect, from others and from myself. I'd let people see me as someone who struggled, someone who needed their pity and careful consideration, when the reality was far different. "Margaret," I said as we concluded our meeting, "I'd like to make some changes. Some investments, some withdrawals, and some new arrangements. I have some plans that will require capital." She smiled, the kind of smile reserved for valued clients. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson. Whatever you need." Walking out of the bank that afternoon, I felt different. Taller, somehow, more solid in my own skin. I had work to do, plans to make, and a point to prove. Jessica thought she knew what she was dealing with when she dismissed me as a broke old lady. She was about to learn how wrong she could be. The weeks following my revelation at the bank felt like waking up from a long sleep. I moved through my daily routines with new purpose, though to anyone watching, I probably looked like the same old princess puttering around her modest house on Maple Street. That was exactly what I wanted them to think. My first real test came 2 days after my meeting with Margaret Williams. I was in my front yard, deadheading the last of the autumn chrysanthemums, when Michael's silver sedan pulled into my driveway. I watched through my peripheral vision as he and Jessica emerged, her designer handbag catching the afternoon sunlight. She was wearing what looked like a new outfit, crisp white jeans, and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "Hi, Mom," Michael called out, his voice carrying that careful cheerfulness he'd adopted lately. "Working in the garden again? You know, you really shouldn't be doing all that bending and kneeling at your age." I straightened slowly, making a show of pressing my hand to my lower back. "Oh, you know me, sweetheart. These old hands need to stay busy." I pulled off my gardening gloves and walked over to greet them. "What brings you by on a Thursday afternoon?" Jessica's smile was as plastic as ever. "We were just in the neighborhood, visiting some friends of Michael's from work. They live over in Riverside Heights now." She said it with that particular emphasis people use when they want you to be impressed by an address. "Beautiful homes over there." Really shows what you can accomplish with the right planning and smart financial decisions. The barb was subtle, but unmistakable. I'd learned to recognize these little digs she'd perfected. Compliments that weren't quite compliments. Observations that carried hidden meanings. A year ago, they would have stung. Today, they just felt pathetic. "How wonderful for them," I said mildly. "Would you like to come in for some coffee? I just baked oatmeal cookies this morning." We settled in my living room, the same space where Jessica had spent 3 years cataloging every sign of my supposed poverty. I served coffee in my everyday cups, not the good china I'd inherited from my mother, and arranged the cookies on a paper plate. I watched Jessica's eyes take inventory, noting the worn spots on my carpet, the outdated television, the family photos in their simple frames. "Princess," she began, settling back in my old recliner with the air of someone about to deliver important news. "Michael and I have been talking, and we're really concerned about your situation here." Michael nodded along, though he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Mom, we know you're proud and independent, but we can see you're struggling. The house is getting harder for you to maintain, and with winter coming, your heating bills must be astronomical in a place this size," Jessica added, gesturing around my modest living room as if it were a mansion. "And what happens when something major breaks down? A new furnace, roof repairs, plumbing issues. Those expenses can really devastate someone on a fixed income." I sipped my coffee and nodded thoughtfully. "It's true, maintaining a home does come with challenges." Jessica leaned forward, sensing an opening. "That's exactly what we mean. And honestly, Princess, we've been thinking about this a lot lately. You're sitting on a gold mine here. This property must be worth something, even if the house is dated. You could sell, downsize to a nice little apartment, or maybe one of those senior communities with activities and meal plans. Think of how much easier your life would be. Plus," Michael added, warming to the subject, "you could have some money in the bank for emergencies. Real financial security instead of worrying about every expense." I set down my coffee cup and studied their faces. Michael looked earnest, genuinely believing he was helping me see reason. Jessica wore the expression of someone doing an unpleasant but necessary favor, like explaining basic math to a slow child. "Where would I go?" I asked, injecting just the right note of uncertainty into my voice. "Well," Jessica said, pulling out her phone, "I've actually been doing some research." She swiped through what looked like a prepared presentation. "There's a lovely place called Sunset Manor. About 20 minutes from here. They have studio apartments, starting at just $1,200 a month, and that includes utilities and one meal a day. Michael's eyebrows shot up. $1,200? That seems like a lot for Mom's budget. Jessica waved dismissively. That's why she'd need to sell the house. The equity would give her enough to cover rent for several years. Plus, she'd have money left over for medical expenses and other needs. It's really the most practical solution. I watched this exchange with growing fascination. They were discussing my life, my future, my home, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person with her own thoughts and feelings. More interesting still was how Jessica was leading the conversation while Michael followed along, nodding at her logic. Of course, Jessica continued, the real estate market isn't what it used to be, especially for older homes that need updating. You might not get full market value, but something is better than nothing. Right. And the longer you wait, the more the house will deteriorate. Have you looked into what the house might be worth? I asked. Jessica shrugged. Honestly, Princess, I'd guess maybe 80 or 90,000 if you're lucky. The kitchen and bathrooms are so outdated, and the electrical probably needs to be completely redone. A buyer would basically be purchasing for the lot value. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing this devastating news about my home's worth. In reality, I'd had the house appraised 6 months ago as part of reviewing my overall financial position. The assessor had valued it at $230,000, noting that while some updates would be beneficial, the solid construction and desirable location made it quite valuable. 90,000, I repeated. That's not very much, is it? Well, no, Michael said gently. But Mom, you have to be realistic about your options. And honestly, even if the house were worth more, would you really know how to handle a large sum of money? Investment decisions, tax implications, that's complicated stuff. Jessica nodded emphatically. Exactly. And unfortunately, older people are prime targets for financial scams. You hear about it all the time. Someone convinces a lonely widow to invest in some scheme, and she loses everything. At least in a senior community, you'd have oversight and protection. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jessica painting increasingly dire pictures of my current situation, and Michael agreeing that immediate action was necessary. They discussed my theoretical budget as if they'd studied it in detail, made assumptions about my expenses that were wildly off base, and spoke about my capabilities as if I were already showing signs of dementia. When they finally left, Jessica hugged me with what might have been genuine warmth if you didn't know it was performed for Michael's benefit. Just think about what we've discussed, okay? We only want what's best for you. Michael lingered on the porch for a moment after Jessica had gotten into the car. Mom, I know this is a lot to think about, but Jessica's really good with financial planning. Her family has a lot of experience with real estate and investments. Maybe you should listen to her advice. I patted his arm. I'll certainly consider everything you've both said, sweetheart. After they drove away, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing what had just happened. This wasn't the first conversation about my housing situation, but it was the most aggressive. Jessica wasn't just making suggestions anymore. She was building a case, presenting what she believed were facts about my limitations and options. The most disturbing part was watching Michael go along with her narrative. My son, who'd grown up in this house, who knew I'd managed our household budget for decades, while Robert focused on his work, was now questioning my ability to handle money or make decisions about my own life. Jessica had convinced him that I was essentially helpless, and he'd bought into it completely. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. Jessica started leaving real estate flyers in my mailbox, listings for senior apartments and retirement communities, always with notes about how perfect they'd be for someone in my situation. She'd call to share articles she'd found about the benefits of downsizing, or to tell me about elderly neighbors who'd made similar transitions and were so much happier now. Michael began dropping by more frequently, always with some observation about the house that reinforced their argument. A loose shingle became evidence that the roof was failing. A creaky floorboard meant the foundation might be compromised. When my garbage disposal made noise, he suggested it was time to face reality about aging infrastructure. Mom, I hate to say this, but you're throwing good money after bad trying to maintain this place, he said one afternoon as I served him lunch. Every repair is just delaying the inevitable. I'd been documenting these conversations in a small notebook, writing down their exact words and the assumptions they made about my finances. The pattern was clear. They believed I was poor, struggling, and incapable of making good decisions. More importantly, they were counting on my supposed poverty to make their arguments compelling. Jessica's true colors showed most clearly when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd overhear phone conversations she'd have with her friends while Michael was visiting, discussing their situation with his mother. She'd describe me as sweet but completely out of touch with reality, and explain how they were, quote, trying to help her see reason before she ends up homeless. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner at their house. I'd brought homemade rolls and my famous apple pie, spending hours in my kitchen preparing things I knew Michael loved. Jessica accepted my contributions with that practiced smile and immediately began rearranging the table to minimize their visibility, as if my modest offerings might embarrass her in front of her parents, who were joining us for the meal. Her father, Richard Caldwell, was exactly what I'd expected, a large man with a firm handshake and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. Her mother, Patricia, was an older version of Jessica, perfectly put together and skilled at making observations that sounded like compliments but felt like assessments. The dinner conversation centered on business, travel, and their various investment properties. Richard held forth on market trends while Patricia shared stories about their recent cruise to Alaska. Michael and Jessica chimed in with updates on their own financial goals, the kitchen renovation, plans for a bigger house, discussions about investment portfolios, and retirement planning. I listened politely, contributing little beyond requests to pass the potatoes or compliments on the excellent turkey. I felt like an anthropologist, studying a different species, observing how they talked about money as both a tool and a scorecard, how they measured success in dollars and possessions. "Princess," Patricia said during dessert, "Jessica tells me you're thinking about making some changes to your living situation. How wonderful that you're being proactive about planning for the future." I glanced at Jessica, who was cutting my pie with surgical precision, as if even its appearance on her table required damage control. "I'm considering various options," I said carefully. Richard nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. Real estate is all about timing. And at your age, you want to make your move, while you still have the energy to handle the transition. Plus, the market could shift at any time." "Exactly," Jessica agreed. "And Princess has been so resistant to our suggestions, but I think she's finally starting to see the practical benefits of downsizing." Patricia leaned forward with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing wisdom with the less fortunate. "My own mother went through the same thing. She held on to her house far too long, and by the time she finally moved to assisted living, the place had become such a burden. If only she'd listened to us sooner, she could have avoided so much stress and expense." "The key," Richard added, "is realistic expectations. A lot of older folks think their houses are worth more than they actually are, especially if they haven't kept up with maintenance and updates. But something is better than nothing, right?" I nodded along with their advice, playing the role they expected, the confused elderly woman grateful for their guidance. Inside, I was calculating. Richard's casual dismissal of my home's value, Patricia's assumption that I was resistant to good advice, Jessica's obvious relief that I was finally starting to see reason. It all painted a clear picture of how they saw me. After dinner, while the men watched football and Patricia helped Jessica with the dishes, I excused myself to use the bathroom. On my way back, I overheard Jessica talking to her mother in the kitchen. "Honestly, Mom, it's been such a frustration. She's living in this money pit, barely scraping by, but she's so stubborn about accepting help. Michael feels terrible, but what can you do when someone won't listen to reason?" "Some people just can't handle change," Patricia replied. "Your father sees it all the time in his business, elderly clients who make poor decisions because they can't adapt to new circumstances. At least you're trying to help her before she loses everything." "That's what I keep telling Michael. We're not being mean, we're being realistic. She can't afford to maintain that house, and every month she delays selling just makes her situation worse. I found several really nice places where she'd be much happier and safer." "Well, dear, sometimes you have to make the hard choices for people who can't make them for themselves. It's not pleasant, but it's the responsible thing to do. I stood in the hallway for several minutes, letting their words sink in. They weren't just discussing my housing situation. They were planning my future based on assumptions about my financial status that were completely wrong. Worse, they'd convinced themselves that their interference was necessary and noble, that I was too incompetent to manage my own life. When I returned to the living room, Michael patted the couch beside him. "Mom, come sit. Jessica's been showing Dad and Patricia some of those places she found for you. They think the Sunset Manor idea sounds really good." Richard muted the television and turned to face me. "Princess, I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of calling a friend of mine who handles senior housing transitions. He says there's quite a bit of demand for your area, and if you're serious about selling, he could probably get you a quick sale." "How quick?" I asked. "Oh, 30 to 60 days if you're flexible on price. The key is setting realistic expectations. Your house is older, needs work, and the market for that type of property is pretty limited. But if you price it to move, someone will bite." Jessica appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. "I told him you'd probably be looking at the 70 to 80,000 range, given the condition issues we discussed." Michael frowned. "That seems low, Jess." "I mean, it's not a mansion, but it's a decent house in a good neighborhood." Patricia shook her head. "Oh, sweetheart, you'd be surprised how little older homes are worth these days, especially when they need so much updating. Princess, you have to think about what a buyer would actually pay for a place that needs a new kitchen, new bathrooms, probably new flooring throughout. Plus," Richard added, "if you wait too long, you'll just have more expensive repairs to deal with. Roofs, heating systems, plumbing, those things don't get cheaper with age. Better to sell now while you can still get something for it." I listened to them dissect my home's value with the detached professionalism of people disposing of an unwanted asset. They spoke about my life's biggest investment as if it were a burden I should be grateful to escape, a financial liability that demonstrated my poor judgment in holding onto it so long. "I appreciate all the advice," I said finally. "It's clear you've all given this a lot of thought." "We just want what's best for you, Mom," Michael said, squeezing my hand. "I know change is scary, but Jessica's right about this being the practical choice." As we prepared to leave that evening, Jessica pressed a folder into my hands. "I put together some information about Sunset Manor and a few other places. Just look through it when you have time. I really think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what's available." The drive home gave me time to process everything I'd heard. They weren't just encouraging me to downsize. They were orchestrating a complete transformation of my life based on their belief that I was financially desperate. They'd created an entire narrative about my limitations, my needs, and my options, all without bothering to learn the truth about my actual situation. Most painfully, Michael had become a full partner in this narrative. My son, who'd grown up knowing I was capable and organized, now saw me through Jessica's lens, as someone who couldn't be trusted to make good decisions about her own life. He'd accepted her assessment of my finances, her evaluation of my home's worth, and her conclusions about what would be best for me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder Jessica had given me, reading through glossy brochures for senior living facilities. The places she'd selected were all on the lower end of the market. Basic apartments with minimal amenities, the kind of housing that suggested its residents were there because they had no other choice. I thought about Margaret Williams at the bank, about the investment statements that showed my actual financial position, about the house appraisal that valued my home at nearly 3 times what Jessica thought it was worth. Then I thought about Robert, who'd always told me that knowledge was power, but only if you were willing to use it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start making some changes. Not the changes Jessica and Michael thought I should make, but the ones that would show them exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. It was time to stop being the broke old lady they expected me to be, and start being the woman I actually was. The next morning, I called Margaret Williams and scheduled another appointment. I had plans to make, and they were going to require more than the modest withdrawals I'd been making from my everyday checking account. It was time to access the resources Robert had so carefully built for exactly this kind of situation. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. For too long, I'd let other people define who I was and what I was capable of. But knowledge, as Robert always said, was power. And I was about to show Jessica and Michael just how powerful a properly informed, broke old lady could be. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when I woke up to find Jessica standing in my kitchen. I'd come downstairs in my robe and slippers, expecting to start my day with coffee and the morning paper, only to discover my daughter-in-law rifling through my cabinets with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, not even having the grace to appear embarrassed about letting herself into my home uninvited. "Oh good, you're up," she said brightly, as if finding her in my kitchen at 7 in the morning was perfectly normal. "I hope you don't mind. Michael gave me his key so I could come by and start assessing what you'll need to pack and what can be donated." I stood frozen in my own doorway, watching this woman who'd just told me she didn't need money from a broke old lady, now treating my home like her personal project. She'd already made neat piles on my counter, dishes she deemed worth keeping versus those destined for charity, my grandmother's serving pieces sorted like garage sale items. "Assessing?" I managed to ask, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Jessica pulled out her phone and showed me what appeared to be a detailed spreadsheet. "I've been working on a timeline for your transition. The realtor Richard recommended can come by next week to give us a formal listing price, and I've already put you on the waiting list at Sunset Manor. There was an opening, but we need to move fast." She continued talking, explaining her plans for my life with the casual authority of someone discussing weekend errands. She'd researched estate sale companies to handle my furniture, contacted donation centers for my clothes, and even looked into services that specialized in helping elderly people adjust to institutional living. "The wonderful thing about Sunset Manor," she said, pulling containers from my spice rack and examining their expiration dates, "is that they provide everything you need: meals, activities, even basic furnishings. You really won't need to bring much beyond personal items and a few mementos." I watched her dismantle my kitchen, this space where I'd cooked thousands of meals, where Robert and I had shared our morning coffee for 37 years, where Michael had done his homework at the table while I prepared dinner. She handled my belongings with the detached efficiency of someone clearing out a storage unit, making decisions about what parts of my life were worth preserving. "Jessica," I said finally, "who told you that you could do this?" She looked up from the cabinet where she was examining my mixing bowls, her expression patient but slightly annoyed, like a teacher dealing with a difficult student. "Princess, we talked about this at Thanksgiving. You agreed that changes needed to be made, and honestly, you're just not equipped to handle this kind of planning yourself. Michael and I are trying to help you transition before things get worse." "I never agreed to anything," I said, my voice stronger now. "And I certainly never gave you permission to come into my house and start packing my belongings." Jessica's carefully maintained composure slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the impatience she usually kept hidden. "Look, I understand this is emotional for you. Change is hard, especially at your age. But the reality is that you can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's clearly not." She gestured around my kitchen as if it were evidence of some catastrophic failure. "Half these spices are expired, you have 3 different sets of measuring cups because you keep forgetting what you already own, and don't even get me started on the safety hazards throughout this house. We're not being cruel, Princess. We're being practical." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like cold water. She'd turned my normal household items into evidence of incompetence, my human tendency to accumulate duplicates into proof of cognitive decline. Worse, she'd convinced herself that her invasion of my privacy was an act of kindness. "Where is Michael?" I asked. "He's at work, obviously. Someone has to maintain a steady income while we deal with this situation." She resumed her sorting, dismissing my question as irrelevant. I told him I'd handle the preliminary assessment since I have more experience with this sort of thing. "What sort of thing?" Jessica sighed with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Helping elderly family members transition to appropriate care. My grandmother went through the same thing. Denial, resistance, making everything much harder than it needed to be. But eventually she realized we knew what was best for her." I stood in my kitchen, wearing my old robe and feeling every one of my 72 years, while this woman, who'd been in my family for less than 3 years, dismantled my life with bureaucratic efficiency. She'd entered my home without permission, made decisions about my belongings without consultation, and justified it all as being for my own good. But what struck me most was her absolute certainty that she was right. Jessica wasn't being malicious. She genuinely believed that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, and that her intervention was necessary. She'd created a narrative where my resistance was just stubborn denial, and my preferences were symptoms of declining judgment. "I want you to leave," I said quietly. Jessica didn't even look up from the cabinet where she was now examining my baking supplies. "Princess, I know this is overwhelming, but running away from reality isn't going to help. Why don't you get dressed and we can drive over to look at Sunset Manor together? I think once you see how nice it is, you'll feel better about everything." I said, "I want you to leave. Now." Something in my tone finally got her attention. She turned to face me, her expression shifting from patient condescension to surprised annoyance. "Excuse me? Get out of my house, Jessica. Take your spreadsheets and your plans and your assessments and get out." For a moment, she just stared at me, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Then her face hardened into something I'd never seen before, cold anger wrapped in wounded righteousness. "Fine," she said, shoving her phone into her purse with sharp, angry movements. "But don't come crying to us when you fall down these stairs, or forget to turn off the stove and burn the place down. Michael and I are trying to help you, and if you're too stubborn to see that, then maybe you deserve whatever happens." She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, pausing in the doorway to deliver one final shot. "You know what your problem is, Princess? You think you're still the same person you were 20 years ago. But you're not. You're a 72-year-old woman living alone in a house you can't afford to maintain, too proud to admit you need help. Michael is going to be heartbroken when he realizes how selfish you're being." The front door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving me alone in my violated kitchen. I stood there for several minutes, shaking with an anger so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. Then I walked to every door in my house and checked the locks, something I hadn't felt the need to do in decades. I spent the rest of the morning putting my kitchen back the way it belonged, returning each misplaced item to its proper location. As I worked, I thought about Jessica's words, the casual way she'd described my life as evidence of failure. 3 sets of measuring cups became hoarding, expired spices became cognitive decline, and my preference for staying in my own home became dangerous stubbornness. But what bothered me most was her absolute confidence in her authority to make these judgments. She'd walked into my house and begun dismantling my life as if she had legal guardianship over someone declared incompetent. She'd made plans for my future without consulting me, then acted surprised when I objected to having my choices taken away. The phone rang while I was reorganizing my spice rack. I knew it would be Michael before I answered. "Mom, what the hell happened this morning?" His voice carried a mixture of confusion and accusation that I'd never heard before. "Jessica is really upset. She says you threw her out of the house and screamed at her for trying to help. She was in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, going through my belongings without permission," I said calmly. "I asked her to leave. She was trying to help you organize for the move. We talked about this, Mom. You agreed that changes needed to be made." "I never agreed to sell my house, Michael. And I certainly never gave her permission to enter my home when I wasn't expecting her, and start packing my belongings." There was a pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had that careful, controlled tone people use when they're trying not to lose their temper. "Mom, I think you're confused about what happened. Jessica was just trying to help you see what a transition would look like. She's dealt with this before. She knows how overwhelming it can be." "I'm not confused, sweetheart. I know exactly what happened. Your wife let herself into my house and began sorting through my possessions as if I'd already agreed to move. When I objected, she told me I was too old and stubborn to make good decisions. She didn't say that. She said I think I'm still the same person I was 20 years ago, but I'm not. She said I'm too proud to admit I need help. She said I deserve whatever happens if I'm too stubborn to accept her assistance." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, maybe she was frustrated because you've been so resistant to practical solutions. We're all just trying to help you avoid a crisis." I felt something inside me break, not from sadness, but from a kind of clarity that comes when you finally understand how bad things have become. My son, my only child, was taking his wife's word over mine about what had happened in my own kitchen. He was explaining away her behavior and questioning my account of events, treating me like an unreliable witness to my own life. "Michael," I said carefully, "do you believe that I'm capable of accurately describing what happened in my own home this morning?" "Of course, but do you believe that I have the right to decide who can enter my house and when?" "Well, yes, but Mom, you're not thinking clearly about your situation. Jessica and I can see things you can't see because you're too close to the problem." "What problem, exactly?" "Your inability to maintain your independence safely. Your resistance to accepting help. Your refusal to plan for the future." Each phrase hit like a diagnosis. In Michael's mind, I wasn't a competent adult with preferences and boundaries. I was a problem requiring management. My desire to stay in my own home wasn't a reasonable choice, but a symptom of declining judgment. My objection to Jessica's unauthorized intrusion wasn't legitimate anger, but confused resistance to necessary intervention. "I see," I said. "And you believe that Jessica's assessment of my situation is more accurate than my own?" "Mom, she's not trying to hurt you. She's trying to help you transition to a safer living situation before something bad happens. Why can't you see that?" "Because nothing bad is happening, Michael. I'm managing my home, my finances, and my health just fine. The only crisis in my life is having my family treat me like an incompetent child." Michael's sigh came through the phone, like a door closing. "This is exactly what Jessica said would happen. She said you'd get defensive and turn this into a conflict between us instead of accepting help." I realized then that I'd lost my son before I'd even known there was a battle. Jessica hadn't just convinced him that I needed supervision. She'd prepared him for my resistance. Every objection I raised, every boundary I tried to set, had been predicted and dismissed as symptoms of the very problem they claimed to be solving. "I think," I said slowly, "that you and Jessica have made some assumptions about my life that aren't based on facts." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that maybe you don't know as much about my situation as you think you do." Michael's voice took on that patient, explanatory tone I'd grown to hate. "Mom, we can see what's happening. The house is falling apart, you're struggling financially, and you're making decisions that don't make sense. We're not trying to control you. We're trying to prevent you from making mistakes that could hurt you." After we hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time, looking at the family photos that Jessica had deemed suitable for packing. Pictures of Michael as a baby, as a toddler, graduating from high school and college. Images of a little boy who'd trusted me completely, who'd believed I could fix anything and solve any problem. Somewhere along the way, that trust had been replaced by something else, a conviction that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Jessica had convinced him that his childhood memories of my competence were outdated, that age had transformed me into someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment. But what hurt most was realizing that Michael wanted to believe it. It was easier for him to accept Jessica's narrative than to question whether their interference was justified. Easier to see me as declining and confused than to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, I knew what was best for my own life. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have shocked the broken old lady they thought I was. I called Margaret Williams at the bank and told her I needed to schedule an urgent meeting, not for the next week or when it was convenient, but today. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "is everything all right? You sound upset." "Everything is fine, Margaret, but I think it's time to make some of those changes we discussed. Significant changes." I hung up the phone and went upstairs to get dressed, choosing my clothes with the same care I'd once reserved for job interviews and important occasions. Today, I was going to stop being the person Jessica and Michael expected me to be, and start being the person I actually was. In my bedroom mirror, I looked at a woman who'd been dismissed, underestimated, and patronized by people who claimed to love her. But I also saw someone who had resources they couldn't imagine, and options they'd never considered. Jessica thought she knew what she was dealing with when she'd walked into my kitchen this morning. She'd seen an elderly woman living in an outdated house, someone too confused and stubborn to accept good advice. What she didn't know was that the broke old lady she'd been planning to warehouse in a budget senior facility was about to disappear, In her place would be someone else entirely. Someone with the financial means to make choices that would shock them all. Someone who'd spent months listening to their assumptions, and was now ready to prove exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. As I drove to the bank, I thought about Robert and the careful plans he'd made for exactly this kind of situation. He'd always said that the best defense against people who underestimated you was to let them keep underestimating you right up until the moment you proved them wrong. Today, I was going to start proving them wrong. And by the time I was finished, Jessica and Michael would understand that they'd made a serious mistake when they decided to treat me like a problem instead of a person. Margaret Williams took one look at my face when I walked into the bank that afternoon, and immediately ushered me into her private office, closing the door behind us. I must have looked different than usual because she offered me water and asked twice if I was feeling all right before we got down to business. "Margaret," I said, settling into the familiar chair across from her desk, "I need to make some substantial changes to my financial arrangements today." She opened my files on her computer, the same accounts that had sat quietly growing for years while I lived like someone counting every penny. "What kind of changes are we talking about, Mrs. Patterson?" "I want to liquidate enough assets to purchase a new home. Something that will make a statement about who I really am, not who people think I am." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. "Are you looking at something specific?" I pulled a folded newspaper clipping from my purse. A real estate listing I'd been studying for weeks without admitting to myself why. "The Morrison estate on Highland Avenue. It went back on the market last month." Margaret's fingers paused over her keyboard. The Morrison estate was Riverside's most prestigious property, a magnificent Victorian mansion that had been featured in home magazines and served as the backdrop for the mayor's annual charity events. The asking price was $850,000. "Mrs. Patterson," she said carefully, "that's a very significant purchase. Are you certain this is something you want to pursue?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." For the next 2 hours, we went through my financial portfolio with the thoroughness of accountants preparing for an audit. Margaret pulled up investment statements, calculated the tax implications of various liquidation strategies, and ran scenarios for financing options. What emerged was a picture of wealth that even I hadn't fully grasped. Robert's life insurance policy had matured into far more than its original value. His carefully chosen stock investments had split and grown over the decades. The small rental property he'd bought in 1987 as a little side investment was now worth 6 times what we'd paid for it. Even the savings bonds he'd purchased religiously every month had compounded into impressive sums. "With the liquid assets from these accounts," Margaret said, running calculations on her screen, "you could purchase the Morrison estate outright without touching your retirement funds or the principal from your other investments. You'd still have substantial reserves for taxes, maintenance, and any improvements you wanted to make." The numbers on her screen represented security I'd never fully appreciated, choices I'd never allowed myself to consider. For years, I'd lived as if Robert's careful planning had provided just enough to get by, when in reality he'd built something that could support any lifestyle I chose. "There's something else," I said. "I want to establish a trust fund. Something substantial that can't be touched or influenced by family members who might question my judgment." Margaret nodded understanding. "Estate planning is always wise, especially when there are concerns about family dynamics." I explained what I wanted: a charitable trust that would support causes I cared about while also providing me with significant tax benefits. The kind of philanthropic arrangement that required serious wealth to establish and maintain. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said when we finished outlining the structure, "this trust alone represents more money than most people see in a lifetime. Combined with your real estate purchase, you're talking about financial moves that will completely transform how people see your position in this community." That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I left the bank 3 hours later, I'd set in motion changes that would shock everyone who thought they knew my situation. Margaret had contacted the real estate agent handling the Morrison estate, initiated the paperwork for liquidating the necessary investments, and scheduled meetings with estate planning attorneys and tax specialists. But my day was far from over. My next stop was Fletcher & Associates, Riverside's most prestigious law firm. James Fletcher had handled the Morrison family's legal affairs for decades and knew more about wealth management and estate planning than anyone in town. If I was going to make changes this dramatic, I needed legal advice from someone who understood exactly what I was doing. James Fletcher was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of quiet authority that came from representing Riverside's most prominent families. His office walls were covered with photographs of him at charity galas, political fundraisers, and business events, with people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, rising to greet me. "Margaret Williams called ahead. She mentioned you're interested in some significant estate planning." I took a seat in one of his leather chairs and folded my hands in my lap. "Mr. Fletcher, I need legal protection from family members who believe I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs." His expression shifted from polite professionalism to focused attention. Family disputes over money and competency were serious legal matters that required careful handling. "Can you tell me more about the situation?" I explained the past few months. Jessica's increasing pressure to sell my house, Michael's growing belief that I couldn't manage my finances, their assumptions about my poverty, and the morning's invasion of my privacy. James listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "And your actual financial position?" he asked when I finished. I handed him the portfolio summary Margaret had printed for me. James studied the numbers with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen many wealthy clients, but I caught the slight widening of his eyes when he reached the totals. "Mrs. Patterson, this changes everything. With assets at this level, you have options most people never consider." He explained the legal protections available to someone in my position: trusts that couldn't be challenged, healthcare directives that couldn't be overridden, financial arrangements that would remain private even from family members. More importantly, he could document my mental competency in ways that would make any future challenges extremely difficult. "There's also the matter of your real estate purchase," he said. "Buying the Morrison estate will send a very clear message about your financial position. It's impossible to hide a transaction of that magnitude in a town this size." That was part of my plan. "Mr. Fletcher, I want to do this properly. I want legal documentation that protects my right to make my own decisions, and I want financial arrangements that can't be questioned or challenged. Can you help me with that?" James smiled for the first time since I'd walked into his office. "Mrs. Patterson, it would be my pleasure." We spent the next 2 hours creating what he called a, quote, "comprehensive protection strategy." Legal documents that established my competency beyond question, healthcare directives that specified exactly who could make medical decisions if I became incapacitated, and financial structures that would remain completely private from anyone who might try to interfere. "One more thing," I said as our meeting wound down. "I want to make some charitable commitments that will be very public. The kind of donations that get announced in the newspaper." James nodded approvingly. "Philanthropy is an excellent way to demonstrate both your values and your capacity for complex financial decision-making." "Do you have specific causes in mind?" I did. The Riverside Public Library needed funding for renovations. The senior center where I'd volunteered for years was struggling to maintain their meal program. The scholarship fund at Michael's old high school could use a significant endowment. "Let's start with $50,000 to each of those organizations," I said, watching James make notes. "And I'd like the donations announced simultaneously, with my name attached." By the time I left Fletcher and Associates, the legal framework for my transformation was in place. Within days, I'd have documentation proving my competency, legal protection from interference, and a financial structure that would support any choices I wanted to make. But the most satisfying part of my afternoon was still ahead. I drove to Riverside Realty, the upscale firm that handled the town's most expensive properties. The office was all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, designed to make clients feel like they were making important investments rather than simply buying houses. Patricia Whitmore, the lead agent, was exactly what I'd expected: perfectly coiffed, expensively dressed, and skilled at sizing up a client's financial potential within the first few minutes of conversation. When I walked in wearing my practical coat and carrying my old purse, I could see her making assumptions about my budget and expectations. "How can I help you today?" she asked with professional politeness that stopped just short of warmth. "I'd like to make an offer on the Morrison estate." Patricia's expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed surprise. The Morrison property? That's a very substantial investment. Perhaps I could show you some other listings that might be more suitable for your needs. I don't need to see other properties. I've been watching the Morrison house for years, and I know exactly what I want. Patricia pulled out a thick folder and opened it to a page of glossy photographs showing the mansion's grand foyer, formal dining room, and sweeping staircase. It's a beautiful property, but the asking price is $850,000, and that's before considering the costs of maintaining a home of this caliber. I pulled out the pre-approval letter Margaret had prepared, showing my ability to purchase the property with cash. Patricia's demeanor changed instantly when she saw the bank's letterhead and the dollar amount. "Oh," she said, her voice taking on an entirely different tone. "Oh my. Mrs. Patterson, I apologize. I didn't realize you were a serious buyer." "I'm very serious. I'd like to make a full-price offer with a 30-day closing." Patricia's hands were actually shaking as she pulled out the purchase agreement forms. The commission on an $850,000 cash sale would be substantial, and she clearly wasn't used to clients who could make decisions of this magnitude so quickly. "Mrs. Patterson, if you don't mind me asking, will this be your primary residence?" "It will. I'm tired of living beneath my means." We spent an hour going through the purchase agreement, with Patricia explaining details about the property that I'd already researched thoroughly. The mansion had been built in 1892 by Riverside's founding family, restored to museum quality in the 1990s, and maintained immaculately ever since. It had 7 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a library, a conservatory, and grounds that would require professional landscaping services. "The maintenance costs alone will be significant," Patricia warned, though she seemed reluctant to discourage such a lucrative sale. "Property taxes, utilities, groundskeeping. You're looking at several $1,000s a month in carrying costs. I'm prepared for that." When I signed the purchase agreement and handed over a certified check for the earnest money, Patricia looked at me like I'd just performed magic. "Mrs. Patterson, I have to say this is one of the most impressive transactions I've handled. Most buyers at this level take months to make a decision. I've had plenty of time to think about what I want." As I drove home from the real estate office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of taking control of my own destiny. For months, I'd listened to Jessica and Michael discuss my limitations, my needs, and my options as if I were a problem to be managed. Today, I'd made financial moves that would reshape not just how they saw me, but how the entire town understood my position in the community. The Morrison estate wasn't just a house. It was a statement. Everyone in Riverside knew the property, knew its history and its value. When news of my purchase became public, it would be impossible for anyone to continue seeing me as a struggling elderly woman living on the margins. But more than that, I'd created legal and financial structures that would protect my independence permanently. No one could claim I was incompetent when I'd just executed one of the most significant real estate transactions in Riverside's recent history. No one could question my judgment when I demonstrated the kind of complex financial planning that required considerable sophistication. That evening, I sat in my living room, the same space where Jessica had dismissed my $800 gift as an embarrassing offering from a broke old lady, and reviewed everything I'd accomplished in a single afternoon. By tomorrow, the legal documents would be filed, the real estate purchase would be in motion, and my charitable donations would be processed for public announcement. Michael and Jessica thought they knew who I was and what I was capable of. They'd built their entire approach to me around assumptions that were about to be dramatically disproven. I looked around at the modest furnishings and outdated decorations that Jessica had used as evidence of my declining circumstances. Soon, I'd be living in the most prestigious address in Riverside, with the financial freedom to make choices that would shock everyone who'd underestimated me. The phone rang, and I saw Michael's number on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, not ready for another conversation about my supposed limitations and their helpful interventions. Tomorrow, when the news started spreading through Riverside's tight social networks, there would be plenty of time for conversations, but they would be very different conversations than the ones we'd been having. For tonight, I was content to sit in my little house on Maple Street and savor the knowledge that everything was about to change. The broke old lady they thought they knew was disappearing, and in her place would be someone who commanded the kind of respect that came with real power. Jessica had said we didn't need money from a broke old lady. She was about to learn exactly how much money this particular old lady actually had. The first sign that my world was about to explode came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd signed the purchase agreement for the Morrison estate. I was making coffee when my phone started ringing, with a persistence that suggested someone had urgent news to share. It was Dorothy Hendricks, my neighbor from 3 houses down, and her voice practically vibrated with excitement. "Princess, honey, are you seeing the newspaper this morning? Because if you're not, you need to get outside and grab a copy right now." I walked to my front porch in my robe and slippers, picked up the Riverside Gazette, and felt a smile spread across my face. There on the front page of the local section was a photograph of the Morrison estate, with a headline that read, "Local philanthropist purchases historic mansion, announces major charitable donations." The article was everything I'd hoped for and more. It detailed my purchase of Riverside's most prestigious property, described my substantial donations to 3 local organizations, and included quotes from the recipients expressing their gratitude for my generous support of community initiatives. The reporter had clearly done her research, because she'd managed to uncover enough details about the transaction to make it clear that this wasn't someone making modest donations from limited resources. What made it even better was the photograph they'd used of me, not some outdated image that made me look frail and elderly, but a recent picture from the library's Volunteer Appreciation Dinner, where I looked vibrant and confident. The caption identified me as, quote, "longtime Riverside resident and community supporter Princess Patterson." My phone rang again before I'd finished reading the article. This time it was Margaret Williams from the bank. "Mrs. Patterson, I hope you're prepared for this. The story's already generating quite a buzz around town. I've had 3 calls this morning from people asking about your community involvement and whether the bank handles your philanthropic foundation." "Philanthropic foundation?" Margaret chuckled. "Well, when someone makes donations of that magnitude, people assume there's a foundation behind it. You might want to consider actually establishing one. It would provide additional tax benefits and give you a formal structure for future charitable giving." After Margaret hung up, I poured my coffee and settled in my kitchen to wait. The article had been published, the news was spreading through Riverside's social networks, and very soon people were going to start making connections between the local philanthropist in the newspaper and the broke old lady Jessica had dismissed so confidently. The first call came at 9:15. Michael's voice was tight with confusion and something that might have been panic. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" "Jessica just called me at work screaming about some newspaper article. She says you bought the Morrison house? That can't be right." "It's right, sweetheart. I closed on the property yesterday. I'll be moving in next month." There was a long silence, filled with the sound of Michael trying to process information that didn't fit with everything he thought he knew about my life. "Mom, the Morrison estate costs almost $1 million. How could you possibly afford that?" "The same way I've afforded everything else for the past 28 years, Michael. I managed my finances carefully and made good decisions." "But you're living on Social Security and Dad's pension. You can barely afford to maintain the house you're in now." I took a sip of my coffee and chose my words carefully. "Actually, sweetheart, I'm living very comfortably on the returns from your father's investments, the income from rental property you didn't know about, and the proceeds from financial decisions I've been making for decades. Social Security is just a small part of my monthly income." Another silence, this one longer and more stunned than the first. "You have rental property?" "Several properties, actually. Your father was quite good at identifying undervalued real estate, plus stock investments, bonds, certificates of deposit, and a few other assets that have performed very well over the years." "Why didn't you tell me?" The hurt in his voice almost made me soften my approach, but I remember Jessica going through my kitchen cabinets and making decisions about my life without consulting me. "Because you never asked about my actual financial situation, Michael. You and Jessica made assumptions based on how I chose to live, not on what I could afford to spend. There's a difference between being poor and being careful with money. But if you have all this money, why were you living like you were struggling?" "I wasn't struggling. I was living within a budget that allowed me to save and invest while still enjoying my life. Your father taught me that wealth isn't about spending everything you have, it's about having choices." Michael's voice took on a desperate edge. "Mom, this doesn't make sense. If you were wealthy all along, why did you let us worry about you? why didn't you just tell us you were fine? Because you weren't worried about me, sweetheart. You were worried about what you thought my problems might cost you. There's a difference. Before Michael could respond, I heard Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. He covered the phone for a moment, and I could hear the muffled sound of an argument. When he came back on the line, his tone had changed. Mom, Jessica thinks this is some kind of scam. She says elderly people get taken advantage of all the time. And someone probably convinced you to sign papers you didn't understand. We need to come over and figure out what's really happening. I laughed, a sound that surprised me with its genuine amusement. Michael, I purchased the Morrison estate with cash after consulting with attorneys and financial advisors. I established a charitable trust, updated my will, and created legal documents protecting my right to make my own decisions. Does that sound like someone who's been scammed? You have attorneys? I have an entire legal team now. James Fletcher is handling my estate planning, Margaret Williams is managing my investments, and Patricia Whitmore helped me purchase what will be the most beautiful home in Riverside. I could hear Jessica's voice getting louder in the background, and Michael covered the phone again. This time the argument lasted several minutes, with Jessica's voice rising to a pitch that suggested she was losing whatever composure she usually maintained. Mom, Michael said when he returned, we're coming over. We need to talk about this in person. Of course, sweetheart. But I should mention that I have a conference call with my financial advisors at 11, and the interior designer is coming by at 2 to discuss renovation plans for the mansion. So if you want to talk, you'll need to work around my schedule. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Then Michael spoke in a voice I barely recognized. Interior designer? Mom, what have you done? I've stopped pretending to be the person you thought I was, and started being the person I actually am. They arrived 45 minutes later, Jessica storming up my front walk like someone approaching a crime scene she intended to investigate personally. Michael trailed behind her, looking stunned and confused, as if he'd woken up in someone else's life. Jessica burst through my front door without knocking and stood in my living room with her hands on her hips, her usual polished appearance disheveled by whatever emotional crisis she was experiencing. All right, princess, what kind of scam are you involved in? Because this whole thing reeks of elder abuse, and I'm not going to stand by and watch you get taken advantage of. I gestured toward the couch with the same hospitality I'd always shown, despite her accusation. Please, sit down. Would you like some coffee? I don't want coffee, I want answers. How does someone who couldn't afford to contribute to our dinner celebration suddenly have enough money to buy the most expensive house in town? Michael sat on the edge of the couch, looking like he was afraid to get comfortable. Mom, please just explain what's happening. The woman in the newspaper article sounds like a completely different person than the mother I thought I knew. I settled into my favorite chair and folded my hands in my lap. I'm the same person I've always been, Michael. The difference is that now you know the truth about my situation instead of operating on assumptions. Jessica pulled out her phone and started scrolling through what looked like the online version of the newspaper article. It says here you donated $50,000 each to 3 different organizations. Where did that money come from? From my charitable giving account, which I established specifically for community donations. You have a charitable giving account? I have several accounts, actually. Your father was very thorough about financial planning, and I've continued managing our investments according to the strategies he established. Jessica's face was turning red, whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. This is impossible. Poor people don't have investment strategies and charitable giving accounts. Poor people worry about paying their electric bills and buying groceries. You're absolutely right, I said calmly, which should tell you something about whether I'm actually poor. Michael leaned forward, his voice pleading. Mom, why didn't you just tell us? When Jessica and I were trying to help you plan for downsizing, why didn't you just say you didn't need help? Because you weren't offering help, sweetheart. You were making decisions based on what you thought my limitations were, not on what I actually wanted or needed. Jessica stood up abruptly and began pacing around my living room, her movements sharp and agitated. This doesn't add up. I've been in this house dozens of times. I've seen how you live, the old furniture, the outdated appliances, the careful way you spend money. None of that fits with someone who has enough wealth to buy a mansion. That's because you equated simple living with poverty. I chose to live modestly because I enjoyed this lifestyle, not because I couldn't afford alternatives. But you acted poor, Jessica snapped. You compared prices at the grocery store, you drove that old car, you wore the same clothes for years. You even tried to give us money for our celebration like you were sacrificing something you couldn't afford to lose. I smiled, remembering the evening that had started this whole chain of events. I offered you $800 as a gift to celebrate Michael's promotion. You told me you didn't need money from a broke old lady and suggested I should save it for doctor visits and prescriptions. Jessica's face went white as the implications hit her. She'd dismissed a gift that represented a fraction of my weekly investment income, treating it like the desperate offering of someone living on the margins. But you let us think you were struggling, Michael said, his voice small and confused. When we talked about selling your house and moving to senior housing, you never said you could afford to stay here. Because staying here was never about what I could afford, Michael. It was about what I wanted. But instead of respecting my choice, you and Jessica decided I was too incompetent to know what was best for myself. Jessica stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. So this whole time, while we were trying to help you transition to appropriate housing, you were secretly wealthy enough to live anywhere you wanted? I wasn't secretly anything. I was managing my finances the same way I've done for decades. The secrecy came from your assumptions about my situation, not from any attempt to deceive you. You deceived us by letting us believe you needed help. I let you believe what you chose to believe. When you saw me comparing prices at the grocery store, you assumed it was because I couldn't afford to pay full price. When you noticed my old furniture, you decided it meant I couldn't afford to replace it. You created a narrative about my limitations and then tried to manage my life according to that narrative. Michael buried his face in his hands. God, Mom, we must have seemed so condescending. All those conversations about budgeting and practical choices. You seemed like people who had decided what kind of person I was without bothering to learn the truth about my situation. Jessica's voice was rising again, taking on the sharp edge it got when she felt cornered. Well, how are we supposed to know? You never talked about having money, never spent money like someone who had it, never gave any indication that you were anything other than a typical elderly woman on a fixed income. Because I didn't think my financial status was anyone's business but mine. We're your family. And as my family, you should have respected my right to live my life according to my own preferences instead of trying to solve problems that didn't exist. The room fell silent as the full scope of their misunderstanding became clear. For months, they'd been treating me like someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment, when in reality, I'd been making sophisticated financial decisions while they worried about my ability to balance a checkbook. Michael looked up from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed with something that might have been tears or just exhaustion. What happens now, Mom? Now I move into my new house, continue supporting causes I care about, and live the way I should have been living all along. And us? Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. I studied her face, seeing for the first time a vulnerability she usually kept hidden behind her polished confidence. That depends on whether you can accept that I'm capable of managing my own life, or whether you're going to keep trying to solve problems that don't exist. Jessica sat down heavily on the couch, her perfect posture finally collapsing. I feel like an idiot. You're not an idiot. You made assumptions based on incomplete information. But Jessica, when I tried to participate in conversations about my future, you dismissed my input as confused resistance. When I objected to your plans for my life, you treated my objections as symptoms of declining judgment. Michael nodded slowly. We did do that. We kept talking about what was best for you without actually asking what you wanted. Because you'd already decided that what I wanted wasn't reasonable or practical. Jessica looked around my living room with new eyes, seeing the same furniture and decorations that had led her to conclude I was struggling financially. So when you were living here like this, it was a choice, not a necessity? It was absolutely a choice. I like this house. I like my simple lifestyle. I liked being able to save money and invest it, and watch it grow into something that could make a real difference in my community. But why didn't you ever talk about your investments or your rental properties or any of it? Because I learned a long time ago that when people know you have money, they start treating you differently. They make assumptions about what you should do with it, how you should spend it, what causes you should support. I preferred being judged on who I was rather than what I was worth. Jessica's laugh was sharp and bitter. Well, that backfired spectacularly, didn't it? We judged you as someone who couldn't take care of herself. You judged me as someone whose opinions about her own life didn't matter. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jessica and Michael asking questions that revealed just how thoroughly they'd misunderstood my situation. They'd assumed my careful spending meant poverty, my simple lifestyle meant limitation, and my age meant incompetence. When they finally left, Jessica paused at the door. "Princess, I owe you an apology, not just for being wrong about your finances, but for the way I treated you, like you were less than capable. Thank you for saying that. Are you going to forgive us?" I looked at her, this woman who'd spent months trying to manage my life based on assumptions she'd never bothered to verify. "I'm going to see how things go. Forgiveness is easier when the behavior changes." After they drove away, I sat in my quiet house and thought about the conversation we'd just had. Michael and Jessica would need time to adjust to the reality of who I actually was, instead of who they'd thought I was. Some relationships survive that kind of fundamental shift in understanding, and others don't. But for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the broke old lady they'd been trying to help, but the woman who'd built a life based on careful choices and intelligent planning. 3 weeks later, I moved into the Morrison estate. The moving trucks caused quite a stir on Highland Avenue, and by evening, half the town knew that the local philanthropist who'd been making headlines was actually Princess Patterson from Maple Street. Michael and Jessica came to my housewarming party, along with Margaret Williams, James Fletcher, Patricia Whitmore, and dozens of neighbors who were seeing me in an entirely new light. Jessica seemed genuinely impressed by my new home, and Michael appeared to be struggling to reconcile this version of his mother with the woman he thought needed protection from her own poor judgment. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Jessica pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Princess, I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was about everything. Not just your finances, but your capabilities, your judgment, your right to make your own decisions. I appreciate that. And I need to ask you something. When you offered us that $800 for Michael's celebration, and I said we didn't need money from a broke old lady, how much did that hurt?" I thought about the question carefully. It hurt because it showed me that you'd never seen me as someone whose contributions had value. But Jessica, it also motivated me to show you exactly who you were dealing with. She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Well, you certainly did that. The whole town is talking about Princess Patterson, the philanthropist who's been hiding in plain sight for years. I wasn't hiding. I was just living according to my own values instead of other people's expectations. 6 months later, I'm fully settled into my new life. The mansion is everything I hoped it would be: beautiful, comfortable, and a perfect setting for the entertaining I'd never allowed myself to do before. My charitable giving has expanded beyond those initial donations, and I've established the foundation Margaret suggested. Michael visits regularly, and our relationship is slowly healing from the damage caused by months of misunderstanding. He's learning to see me as someone who's always been capable of managing complex situations, not someone whose competence declined with age. Jessica and I are still working on finding a new equilibrium. She's apologized repeatedly for her assumptions and her treatment of me, but trust takes time to rebuild. She's trying to develop a relationship with the real me, instead of the person she thought she was helping. Sometimes I think about that morning when Jessica was going through my kitchen cabinets, making decisions about my life without consulting me. If someone had told me then that within 6 months I'd be living in Riverside's most prestigious home and recognized as one of the community's leading philanthropists, I wouldn't have believed them. But Robert always said that the most powerful thing you can do is surprise people who underestimate you. He was right about that, just like he was right about so many other things. The broke old lady Jessica dismissed so confidently never really existed. She was just a story people told themselves to make sense of choices they didn't understand. The real Princess Patterson was always here, managing her finances carefully, making thoughtful decisions, and building something meaningful with the resources she'd been blessed to have. Sometimes the most satisfying victory isn't proving people wrong. It's showing them who you really are when they finally have eyes to see it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.